Good morning. One thing real quick, there's a suggestion box in the back. It's not the offering box, by the way, so don't put the offering in the suggestion box or vice versa. And we are doing our first Sunday assembly the second Sunday, right? July 12th, is it the 12th? Yeah, July 12th, and I'm going to go through some of those suggestions, and one of the topics, the only really one that I have so far, I have some ideas and some concepts that were put forward, but there's only one topic to look at, and it's a really hard one. So if you don't mind giving me some more softballs or whatever you feel like. No, but seriously, as much as possible, and this might be an ongoing thing, so if we don't get to them all, hopefully on another first Sunday we can go through some of those things. So seriously, any questions you have, a passage that you struggle with, an idea, anything like that, just toss it on in there. And no promises, but I'll read it at least, if nothing else. Last month, wow, I don't know what month it is. Last month, just a lot going on for me personally, and over this past week, there's some family things and health issues to attend to, and then when I finally got home after all that, it was really hot in my house, and as you know, that's why I wasn't here Wednesday. The house was 88 degrees, and I was so then, thank you, by the way, to all those who offered to let us stay. Thank you so much, y'all. That's not an easy thing to do, so thank you all. But as I was sitting there for a couple days waiting for, some of y'all know Oleg, AC guy. I was waiting for Oleg to come by and fix my AC, and just sitting there in that hot house for hours at a time, it makes you think. It makes you think for a while. And I'm not equating that to Job at all, just to be clear. It just made me think about suffering in general. And I just got to thinking, man, what did people do before AC at all? I don't understand how anyone could live like this. And then it just made me think of just suffering just in general, and just I know so many of you that just go through so many various kinds of suffering, albeit mental, physical, trauma, things outside of your control. And there has been a lot of literature and sermons and thoughts and discussions about suffering and God. And none of them are really satisfactory, to me at least. I think that's why people still write about it. That's why people still talk about it, is because there's yet to be one solid, this is the antidote, right? This is the answer to why there is suffering. And in fact, this is just what has plagued humanity, since the dawn of time, is this idea of suffering and God. And so I really want, first of all, not to sound selfish, I want myself to have the correct view of suffering. I want to have the view about suffering that Jesus had, whatever that was. And as a teacher and minister here, I want you all to have a view of suffering that Jesus held. And I think a way that we can do that is to open up our Bibles and read them. And so today we're going to talk about Job, Jesus, and suffering. So before we do the first part, which is looking at Job, I want to begin with Jesus, because understand that Jesus grew up and was rooted in Scripture, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. In fact, in Luke 24, verse 44, this is after Jesus is resurrected, it says, "Then he said to them, 'These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms,'" also known as the Old Testament, "everything written in the Psalm and everything must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures, right? To understand. So when Jesus was reading the Torah, right? When he was reading the Tanakh, when he looked at that, he said, "Oh, this is about me. This is about what I'm doing in the world. This is about my mission. This is about what I've done, what I'm doing, and what I'm going to do." And so if we want to understand Jesus' perspective, if we read the Old Testament, we can see Jesus. Jesus saw himself in Scriptures. And man, I wish I could sit in on that Bible study. Best Bible study ever, by far. And then I want to look at how Paul also looked at Old Testament Scriptures. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1, he says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea." Now this is, again, very interesting, because we know the Corinthian church was made up of Jew and Gentile. And this is Israel's scriptures, okay? And so he's writing to Gentiles. And even in the context, he's addressing the Gentiles. And notice what he says. Our fathers. What's he doing? He's including the Gentiles into Israel's stories, into Israel's scriptures. It's kind of like if I say, no, that's a bad example. I'll stick with this example. It's a better one. Verse 2, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. In other words, that when we look at the Old Testament scripture, not only are we learning about Jesus, because Jesus said, hey, it's all about me. Everything is about me in the Old Testament scriptures. Not only are we learning about Jesus and his mission and work and what he's doing, but also, according to Paul, we're learning about ourselves. We're learning about our role in redemptive history, in salvation history. And Paul grafts us in, even as Gentiles, into Israel's story, and we become part of it. So, if there's any book of the Bible that's dedicated to the concept of suffering and God, I think Job is just a monolithic piece of literature on that very topic. So what exactly does Job have to teach us about Jesus and ourselves in the story of what God is doing in the world and about our suffering? So let's look at Job. I want to look at a few key points. I'm not going to be relitigating the whole Bible class we did about a year ago or so on Job, but a few key concepts. One, about Job's character. That is, he was blameless and upright. You know what that immediately does? It removes any cause for us to say, Job was suffering because sin, because he did something bad and he's reaping what he has sown. Not the case at all. And in fact, if you look at the very beginning of the book, it says, there was a man in the land of Uz, and his name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. That language is only used about, I believe, Noah, Daniel, and Abraham. That righteous, that upright and righteous and feared God, turned away from evil. So he's placing Job in that like hall of fame, right, of faithful, trusting, obedient people. Look at verse 8. It says, and the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? Notice something here. Both the narrator and God himself identifies Job as blameless and upright. And Job himself identifies himself as blameless and upright. So by 2 or 3 witnesses, right, he's testified that he is blameless and upright. Second, he was made to suffer by God. And that makes us very uncomfortable, and rightfully so. I think it should be. But watch where this flows through. So notice this. In Job 9:22, it says, Job is speaking here. He says, it is all one. Therefore I say he destroys both, that he, being God, destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, he mocks at the calamity of the innocent. The earth is given into the hands of the wicked. He covers the faces of its judges. If it is not he, who then is it? So it's clear throughout Job's dialogues that he says repeatedly, God has done this. God has done this. I don't know. How can I argue with him? He's more powerful. And he says, if it's a contest of might, he is more powerful than I. And if you think that Job is just blinded by his suffering and speaking inaccurately, look at what the narrator says in chapter 42, verse 11. It says, then came to him all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before and ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. So the narrator attributes God as at least culpable for Job's suffering, whether that be just through permission or activity, it doesn't specify. But even more importantly, if you think Job and the narrator are biased, look at God's very own words in the book. Look at chapter 2, verse 3. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity. Notice this, God is speaking to Satan. Although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. God himself takes responsibility or culpability in Job's sufferings. God doesn't let himself off the hook in this situation. So that's important to know. But it's also important to know that God isn't the only factor at play here, because it shows us in the very book that Job had a spiritual antagonist. Look back at chapter 1, verse 9. It says, then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now this is very important because we see just Satan's nature. And Satan means opposer or accuser or executioner at some points. In other words, it seems like Satan is just against it, right? He's saying, God, your policies don't actually allow people to be righteous. I think people are bad. And the only reason why he's good is because you've done good stuff for him. If you change it, he'll be bad. So notice he's not only questioning God's wisdom and how he deals with humanity, but he's also questioning Job's ability as a human to be righteous. It's kind of like a really annoying prosecutor, right? Or district attorney, always trying to convict you. And this language is used consistently in the prophecy of Zechariah. And I believe Joshua, the high priest, Satan stands there before God accusing the high priest, saying he's not worthy to be here. In other words, he just wants people to fall down. He wants people to fall. He wants people to be found guilty. And if you look at chapter 2, verse 4, it says, then Satan answered the Lord, this is after Job passes the first test, and said, skin for skin, all that a man has, he will give for his life. He didn't take the L, right? He's like, no, I know I lost that one. Let me try again. I'll show you. I thought of a different way of how I'm actually right in this situation. Usually doesn't go well when you try to argue with God. I'll give you another shot. Verse 5, but stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. So Satan, this is important, is antagonistic towards God's policy as well as his righteous servant. We often think of like Job as why do bad things happen to good people? It's not really a one-to-one ratio because God says there's none like him on the earth. It's not just good people. No one is like Job. He's upright, and God identifies him as his faithful servant. There's none like my servant on the earth. So he was blameless and upright. He was made to suffer by God. There's also a spiritual antagonist at work. But also, accompanied with Job's sufferings, he was betrayed by his friends and mocked. Now, that can sometimes be worse than physical pain, right? To experience the emotional, the spiritual betrayal of people who you count on, who you share, right? Like your spirit with, like you're part of me. And when you betray me, it feels like part of myself, right, has been poisoned or killed. And look at chapter 6, verse 27. Job speaks to his friends. He says, you would even cast lots over the fatherless and bargain over your friend. Like you'd play a hand of poker, right, for the fatherless, that winner gets the orphan. And bargain, right, trade, you'd sell out. This is literally, you'd sell out your friend for a profit. And notice that Job's friends, their greatest wisdom was when they were just silent and mourned with Job. That was the smartest thing they did in the entire book of Job, was when they just kept their mouth shut. But they weren't content to do that. And they say, and a few examples, again, I could be exhaustive with this, but we don't have the time. One of them says, know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Hey, Job, I know you lost all your possessions, your livelihood, your work, and your children, and your health, and you're literally finding relief by like cutting into your flesh with broken potsherds, but guess what? You actually deserve worse. Man, that's pretty brutal. That's about as comforting when I was in the hospital with a kidney stone. We didn't know what it was. And my dad said, hey, you know what's funny? I said, what, Dad? He goes, I don't feel a thing. I was like, oh, that's real comforting. That's real helpful in this situation. All right, this is a step above that. You actually deserve worse. Look at chapter 22, verse 5. One of his friends says, is not your evil abundant? There is no end to your iniquities. He's like, Job, you're so bad. There's no end to it. You just never stop sinning. You're just constantly the worst person ever. That's why you're suffering so much. Here's another example. And this is almost worse than those other, right, like mocking or abuse. Chapter 8, verse 5, they say to Job, if you will seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy, if you are pure and upright. What is Job? He is pure and upright. Surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation. Job's friends are convinced that if Job really was righteous, if he really was the faithful servant of God, then God would do something about it. Then God would rescue him from the suffering that he was in. Finally, or not next to last, Job was vindicated by God. This is like when you read just the brutal, right, dialogues and monologues of Job and his friends. Chapter 42, verse 7, it says, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken to me what is right as my servant Job has. So notice, although God seems to reprove Job for his speeches, God turns around and says, hey, he was right. Job spoke about me, right. You all didn't. Although the whole time they were offering theodicies, in other words, defense of God's justice and his nature. And God says, you weren't right in any of that. And then look at verse 12. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. The ultimate told you so, right? That God speaks on your behalf and say, hey, he's right. Y'all are wrong, dead wrong. And this gets us to the final parallel with Job. And that is Job was given the role of intercessor. That once he had faithfully endured and suffered, again, with a lot of pain, with a lot of anguish, with a lot of doubt, with a lot of harsh language, right, towards God, and even anger at times and despair towards God, God vindicates him and through his suffering makes him an intercessor. And this part we often miss. Chapter 42, verse 8. Now, therefore, God says, take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to who? Go to my servant Job and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves, and my servant Job shall pray for you. I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly, for you have not spoken to me what is right as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite went and did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. Now, that's the ultimate told you so. God's not going to forgive you unless I make intercession for you. All right, so I just want you to look at that again. Look at that list. Blameless and upright, made to suffer by God, had a spiritual antagonist, was betrayed and mocked, vindicated by God, and given the role of intercessor. All right, when Jesus, from the young age, right, as a boy, read the story of Job, what do you think he thought? I think you look at that and go, everything written in the scriptures is going to be fulfilled in me. Because guess how the book of Job ends? Even with the rejoicing part. You know the last verse? Job died. That's how it ends. Job died. It was a good old age, but guess what? At the end of the day, Job still died. The suffering is still not completely redeemed. And I hope all of this sounds familiar because I think Job directly points us to Jesus, because Jesus was both blameless and upright. And if you read Isaiah 53 and just constantly flip in your Bible between that and Job, you'll be amazed. In Isaiah 53:9, it says, and they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. That's very similar language is used about Job. Job spoke rightly. Matthew 3:16, it says, and when Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up from the water, and the Spirit of God descends on him. In verse 17, it says, and behold, a voice from heaven said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. In other words, there's no one like him on the earth. There's no one like my Son. Jesus was blameless and upright. And Jesus was made to suffer by God. And this is it's uncomfortable for us. I realize that. It's uncomfortable for me when we see the language about God taking responsibility for Job's suffering. We're like, well, God had a hand in Job's suffering even though he was righteous. But then when it comes to Jesus, we're like, oh yeah, I don't get that. It's the same thing. It's someone who suffered unjustly and God ordaining, working through it, permitted it. And that exact thing that happened to Job by God happened to God's own Son. Look at Isaiah 53:10. It says, yet it was the will of who? It was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. That Yahweh says, my faithful suffering servant, I'm the one that's crushing him. I'm the one that have put him to grief. And look at Matthew 26:39, Jesus in the garden, right? What does he pray? My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. This cup of suffering, of unjustly suffering. He didn't do anything that deserved it. He's blameless and upright. Yet Jesus says, not as I will, but as you will. Which means what? That it was the Father's will to put him to grief. It was the Father's will to crush him. But what do we also know? There's a spiritual antagonist at work. Look at Isaiah 53:6. It says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So there again, we see the Lord's hand in it. But look at verse 8. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. So does that sound just? Sounds like there's another factor, right? Another role at play here. And then if you look at Matthew 4:1, just to see this odd pairing, it says that after Jesus was baptized, right? God said, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Then Jesus was led up by who? The Spirit. This is the very Spirit of God. Jesus is led by the Spirit into the wilderness. Why? To be tempted by the devil. In other words, to suffer. God led him to suffer, to Satan, for Satan to inflict suffering and temptation. But look at what Jesus says, or what is recorded in John 13:27. It says, then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him, Judas. And what was Judas going to do? Betray. Kind of get the ball rolling for Jesus' crucifixion. And who did that? Who had a hand in that? It was Satan. But also who had a hand in it? God had a hand in it. This weird mixture here. And look at Luke 22:53 when Jesus is arrested. As he's being arrested, Jesus says, when I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour, physical people that are arresting me, and the power of darkness. In other words, Satan and the spiritual forces of evil. Jesus says, hey, it's your hour. It's Satan's hour. But it's also the hour for my Father's will to be done. How do those two things coexist? It's kind of the rub, isn't it? That's kind of the difficult. But we also know that Jesus was betrayed and mocked. So we know that Peter, right? Peter denies him 3 times before the rooster crows. We know that Judas betrayed him. But also, I think of this, as Jesus is hanging on the cross, the crowd say, he trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he desires him, for he said, I am the Son of God. I think of Job's friends saying, hey, if you just repent, if you cry out to God, he will deliver you, right? If you're found to be just. And the crowd is saying the same thing to Jesus as he hangs on the cross. Hey, if you're really just, if you really are the Son of God, God would rouse himself and do something about it. God would restore you right now. He wouldn't let you go through this, in other words. Jesus was vindicated by God. As Peter addresses on the day of Pentecost, the same audience that likely was shouting those things at Jesus as he hung on the cross. Peter says, let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Messiah and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. That's vindication. He talks about this assurance by raising him from the dead. Or 1 Timothy 3:16, Paul says, great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory. And finally, Jesus was given the role of intercessor. Isaiah 53:12, it says, therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for transgressors. Remember, Job's friends, they were wrong, right? And God says, hey, Job, after all this suffering, he was right, y'all were wrong. Job, now be an intercessor for them, for the transgressors. Jesus becomes the very intercession for the people who mocked him, who betrayed him, right? Who doubted him. Hebrews 7:25, it says, consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost. Think about being saved. What a wonderful concept. Think about being saved to the uttermost, whatever that means. That's just extra on top, like to the uttermost, your salvation. Those who draw near to God through him, since, what's our confidence in? How can we know that we can be saved to the uttermost? Through Jesus, since he always lives to make intercession for them. In other words, Job, even after his intercession, right? He's reproved, he's vindicated, faithfully suffers, all those things. At the end of the story, he dies. Very last verse, he dies. Jesus is in the heavenly realm, as the Hebrew author tells us, as a high priest. And he doesn't have to make any more sacrifices. He stands directly before the Father's face and vouches for us. Therefore, we are saved to the uttermost. So what does Job and Jesus teach us about suffering in our story as we are grafted into Israel's stories and scriptures? First of all, and this is important, it's also hard at the same time, God is sovereign over suffering. Everything is within God's control. We don't suffer because God is not powerful enough to stop it. In other words, nothing surprises God. Look at 1 Peter 4:19. Therefore, let those who suffer according to what? According to God's will, entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. Guess what that means? Sometimes God's will includes suffering, even unjust suffering. And notice in Acts 14:21, it says, when they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples. How'd they strengthen the souls of the disciples? How'd they encourage these different churches on their way? Encouraging them to continue in the faith and saying that through many through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. What an encouraging lesson, brother. Hey, thanks for stopping by and reminding me of all that I'm going to think about. This is how they encouraged one another, was reminding, hey, because that's so foreign to us, because we think suffering is somehow absence of God. And what Job and Jesus show us is that sometimes suffering is precisely because God is with us, because God is manifesting himself and his will in our lives. And that just seems counterintuitive to us. But I don't think it's a coincidence that in cultures and times when the church has truly struggled, or when there has been real persecution, there has been a boom in faithfulness and conversion. I know correlation doesn't always equal causation, but I think the more that people suffer, the more costly the sacrifice is. Sometimes people just see this is more needed, more now than ever. I think as we get more, distance from things like AC, right, or abundant access to food when we need it. I think, the first time we stub our toe, we're like, oh my God, we don't get it. But the more we suffer, really, the more we can become in tune with God's will and the person he is shaping us to be in our lives. Second, and this is, I cringe to the uttermost. I cringe to the uttermost when people view like Satanism, or like Satan as like cool or rebel, or like like a leather jacket smoking a cigarette kind of figure. Do you enjoy human suffering? Do you enjoy human violence? Do you enjoy broken families? Guess what? Guess who's the source of those things? Satan. The source of dehumanization, enslavement, to treat other imagers of God as just property or things or something to be abused or used to take advantage of. Guess what? That doesn't come from the good world that God created. It comes from the will of a spiritual antagonist. Luke 22:31. Jesus says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. All right, what does Satan want to do? All right, he doesn't want to just give you a love tap. He doesn't want to just push you. He wants to destroy you. He wants to sift you like wheat. Look at Luke 13:16. Jesus sees this woman with severe scoliosis. She can't stand upright. And Jesus healed her. And Jesus said, and ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day. Revelation 12:10, it describes that Satan is the accuser of our brothers. In other words, I just want this to be in our heads. Satan delights in your suffering. Satan delights in tearing you down. Satan delights in proving you guilty to the Father. That's what he lives for. That's what he loves to do. And I just want to have the perspective that when we see suffering, yes, it very well may be God's will, and God may be doing something through that. But guess what? On the flip side, when Jesus would see, someone just suffering from like severe scoliosis, he'd say, that snake is doing this. And I'm going to do my Father's will through it. Third, God works redemptively through suffering. That Satan uses suffering as an attack, as a weapon to tear us down, to prove us guilty. God uses suffering to make us more like his Son. Paul's famous passage about the thorn in his flesh, right? He says that it's a messenger of Satan sent to harass him. So we see Satan's will in that. Satan's trying to tear Paul down. And when Paul cries to the Lord 3 times to remove this suffering, what does Jesus say to him? My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So yeah, Satan's doing something, but guess what? God can use the weapons of the enemy to be a tool for your salvation, for your growth. God doesn't have to change Satan's pitchforks into like a pillow, right? He can use that pitchfork and still make it into life if we suffer faithfully. In other words, the only way out of suffering is through it. Right? It's not around it, it's through it. And then, I just got to read this. 2 Corinthians 4:16. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Fourth, the answer to suffering is a person. This is the final point. The answering to suffering is a person. Hebrews 2:14, it says, since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself, Jesus, likewise, partook of the same things, that through death, right, not around death, didn't circumvent death, through it, Jesus entered into death and suffering. He might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. I love how Acts 10:38, how it's recounted. He went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. He served his whole ministry involved in the suffering, right? He got his hands dirty. He put on flesh. He suffered himself. He saw and healed other people suffering. And the whole time he saw that snake is up to it all over. And I'm going to bring God's will, the Father's healing, the Father's faithfulness to his creation, and embody that in myself so much that I'm going to die. I'm going to put on that death. I'm going to go through death to destroy the power of death, to destroy the weapon of the devil. There's no clean answer, all right? I don't have a theodicy. I don't have a one-sentence summary like this is the answer to suffering. This is why God allowed the serpent to be in the garden. This is why God allowed the Satan to attack Job. I don't have that. I think there's continually going to be people who speculate about that. I don't know what the answer is for why God allows suffering. I do know what the answer isn't. I think that's much more important. We can know what the answer isn't for why we suffer. It's not because God is not in control. As Job said, if it's not him, then who is it, right? God is sovereign over all these things in my life. And it isn't solely because of sin. Sometimes, time and chance happen to us all. Sometimes it's just, that stinks. Sometimes it's just suffering. And it can't be that we suffer because God doesn't care. Why do I say that? Why do I know that? Because Job had this experience. Through his suffering, he was doubting, just wanted to understand why. And Job does not end with an answer. It doesn't end with an answer. You know what it ends with? Job sees God. He says, behold, I have heard, but now I see. And I put my hand over my mouth. Now I've seen you. I've experienced you. There goes my questions. There goes my doubts. There goes the theodicy. There goes all the defenses. It's all disappeared because I'm beholding you. And when we look at Jesus, who put on flesh, he endured the very suffering. That through many sufferings, that through suffering and obedience, he would learn obedience. Why? To bring many sons to glory. So we suffer, okay? People try to academically study suffering. One thing I know, there's nothing academic about suffering, okay? There's nothing academic about it. It's brutal and it's real. And it's so real that Jesus put that on himself. that Jesus endured it along with you to work redemptively through it, to destroy the power of Satan, to destroy the power of death, and to mold you to be like him so that you can have the life that he now lives. He gives to you when we put our faith in him in baptism, and we raised up a new creature. So I hope this was encouraging to you. Maybe you have more questions. I do too, trust me. But when you doubt, when you suffer, when you're just gritting your teeth, just look at the cross and know, I know what the answer is. And I'm going to entrust my soul to the one who is faithful. If you have any need this morning, we ask that you come forward as we stand and sing.